Under a gray sky and the bitter cold of winter, tens of thousands of men, women, and children trudged westward through mud and snow. Many had no shoes. Some carried their elders on their backs. Others left behind graves that stretched for miles along the road. They were not soldiers or criminals. They were the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. Entire nations, forced from their homes by the government of the United States. What happened to them would become one of the darkest and most heartbreaking chapters in American history. This is the story of the Trail of Tear, the tragic journey that erased Native nations from their ancestral lands and reshaped America forever. When the first Europeans arrived on the eastern shores of North America, they encountered powerful and organized societies. The Cherokee ruled over fertile valleys in the Appalachian Mountains. The Creek and Choctaw dominated the forests of the Deep South. The Chickasaw guarded the riverlands of Mississippi. The Seminole thrived in the swamps of Florida. These were not wandering tribes. They were nations with systems of government, trade networks, written languages, and deep cultural traditions. By the early 1800s, they were often called the Five Civilized Tribes, not because they needed validation, but because American observers admired how quickly they adapted to certain Western ways. They built schools, wrote constitutions, and established towns with courts and farms. Some even owned printing presses and published newspapers. Yet no amount of adaptation could protect them from what was coming. The United States was expanding fast. By 1800, its population had grown to more than 5 million, doubling every 25 years. The hunger for land was insatiable. Settlers, poor farmers, and ambitious speculators all looked westward toward the territories still controlled by native nations. To them, the lush lands of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi were a promise of prosperity. To the indigenous people who lived there, it was their home, sacred, inherited, irreplaceable. But to the American government, it became an obstacle to progress. The spark that lit this tragic fire came with one of the most consequential presidencies in U.S. history, Andrew Jackson. A war hero and frontiersman, Jackson had built his fame by fighting against Native peoples during the War of 1812 and the Creek War. His victory at Horseshoe Bend in 1814 opened vast new lands in the South to white settlement. Jackson viewed Native nations not as sovereign peoples but as subjects standing in the way of America's destiny. When he became president in 1829, he was determined to remove them once and for all. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, one of the most infamous laws in American history. It authorized the president to negotiate exchange treaties with native tribes, trading their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi River for lands in the west, in what is now Oklahoma. On paper, it sounded like a voluntary deal. In reality, it was a blueprint for forced expulsion. The United States promised protection and support, but few native leaders trusted these words. They had seen promises broken before. The Choctaw were the first to face removal. In 1831, thousands of Choctaw people began the journey westward. They were told it would be a short and organized process, but chaos reigned. Poor planning, corruption, and harsh weather turned it into a nightmare. With little food, inadequate clothing, and disease spreading through camps, an estimated 1 in 4 Choctaws perished. One witness described it as a trail of tears and death, a phrase that would later define the suffering of all the nations forced west. Next came the Creek and Chickasaw, facing similar ordeals. But the most well-known and devastating removal was that of the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee had done everything the U.S. government said they should. They had adopted a written constitution, established schools, and even built a capital at New Echota, Georgia. They had their own written language created by Sequoyah and published a bilingual newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. Many hoped that by embracing aspects of American governance, they could secure their future as a sovereign people. But the discovery of gold on Cherokee land in 1828 changed everything. Almost overnight, thousands of settlers flooded into Cherokee territory. Georgia passed laws declaring Cherokee lands part of the state and banned the tribe's government. When the Cherokee resisted, their case went to the U.S. Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. The court ruled in their favor, recognizing the Cherokee Nation as a distinct community in which Georgia law had no authority. It was a landmark decision for native sovereignty, but President Jackson reportedly responded with chilling indifference. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. The federal government ignored the ruling, and the Cherokee were left defenseless. Under immense pressure, a small group of Cherokee leaders, without authorization from their national council, signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. It ceded all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi in exchange for land in the West and money. The vast majority of Cherokee opposed the treaty, but the U.S. Senate ratified it anyway by a single vote. When the deadline for voluntary removal passed, only a few hundred had gone west. The rest, more than 16,000 people, were to be rounded up and forced out. In the spring of 1838, U.S. troops and state militias began the roundup. Soldiers marched into Cherokee homes, dragging families from their fields, churches, and cabins. Many were held in crude camps, makeshift prisons, for months waiting for removal to begin. Diseases spread rapidly. In the autumn, the forced march west began. Divided into detachments, the Cherokee traveled overland through Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas. It was an 800-mile journey that would last through one of the harshest winters in memory. Snow and freezing rain turned the paths into rivers of mud. Supplies promised by the government often never arrived. Food ran out. Thousands died along the way, from hunger, exposure, and exhaustion. Mothers buried their children beside the road. Elders collapsed and were left behind. The suffering was beyond measure. By the time they reached Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, an estimated 4,000 Cherokee were dead. 1 in every 4 had not survived. The Seminole of Florida faced a different kind of fate. When ordered to leave, they refused. Under leaders like Osceola, they fought back in what became known as the Second Seminole War, a brutal guerrilla conflict that lasted from 1835 to 1842. It was one of the longest and costliest wars ever fought by the U.S. Army against native peoples. The Seminole used the swamps and forests of Florida to their advantage, ambushing and disappearing before troops could retaliate. Despite years of fighting, disease, and devastation, many Seminole never surrendered. A small number of their descendants still live in Florida today, one of the few native groups never completely removed. By the 1840s, the Indian Removal Act had achieved its grim goal. Tens of thousands of Native Americans had been pushed west of the Mississippi. The U.S. government called the area Indian Territory, promising it would be theirs forever. But history would prove otherwise. As white settlers and railroads pushed ever westward, even this land was gradually taken. What was supposed to be a permanent refuge became yet another broken promise. The human cost was immense. Whole nations had been uprooted, their cultures shattered, their numbers decimated. Traditional knowledge, languages, and sacred sites were lost. The survivors had to rebuild their lives in unfamiliar lands, often clashing with other displaced tribes. And yet, despite everything they endured, the Cherokee re-established their government in Oklahoma and built new schools. The Choctaw and Chickasaw adapted and thrived. Their resilience became a quiet defiance against erasure. The Trail of Tears was not just a tragedy of the past, it was a warning about the power of greed and the consequences of dehumanization. It revealed how a nation that spoke of liberty could commit such an injustice in the name of progress. For many Americans today, the story remains uncomfortable, but to forget it would be to deny the foundations upon which the modern United States was built. Some historians see the Indian Removal Act as a product of its time, a policy driven by expansionist dreams and a belief in manifest destiny. Others see it for what it truly was, an act of calculated dispossession, cloaked in the language of law and civilization. It set a precedent for the treatment of indigenous peoples across the continent, from the Great Plains to the Pacific coast. Each removal, each broken treaty echoed the same story: a people displaced, a culture under siege, a promise betrayed. And yet, the legacy of those who walked the Trail of Tears still lives on. Their descendants carry their languages, their traditions, and their stories into the modern era. Across Oklahoma, North Carolina, and beyond, the Cherokee Nation and other tribes continue to reclaim their heritage and assert their sovereignty. They have built thriving communities, schools, and governments, proving that despite everything, despite being nearly erased, they never truly disappeared. When we speak of the Trail of Tears, we often focus on the suffering, but it's also a story of survival, a testament to human endurance and the will to exist. Against impossible odds, these nations endured centuries of violence and betrayal, yet they preserved their identity. Their survival is their victory. Today, memorials mark the paths they walked, stretching across 9 states. Each marker stands as a silent reminder of what was lost and what was carried forward. The Trail of Tears was not just a journey westward. It was the painful birth of a new America, one built on contradictions, ambition, and tragedy. And though it was meant to erase nations, it could not erase memory. The spirit of those who walked still echoes in the rivers they crossed, in the songs they sang, and in the generations who remember. The Trail of Tears remains one of the darkest stains on the American story, a time when the dream of freedom came at the cost of another people's survival. But it's also a story that demands to be told, not to shame, but to remember. Because only by remembering can we begin to understand the true price of the world we live in today. And so, as we look back on that cold and endless road, we must ask, was this the price of progress? Or the proof that progress without compassion is no progress at all?